My name's Cathy Daniels, and I wanted to tell you a story about my great aunt, whose name, she was called Fanny Daniels, although we called her Auntie Fay. She was my father's aunt, and she was born in St George's in the East in, I have to get this right, 1896. When she was very young, when she was a child, she had an accident with a swing and she lost an eye. So she spent all her life with one glass, well, most of her life, with one glass eye and one eye that worked. And her father, who was my great-grandfather, had come from Poland with his wife, and she was, I think, the second child who was born in this country. And they were tailors. In fact, they were waistcoat makers rather than, making coats. And they had a small business. And she grew up learning tailoring because there wasn't much education for girls in those days. It didn't matter how bright you were. There wasn't, schooling was very basic. And girls weren't expected to have careers. They just worked. And because of the time that she was born, she was sort of grown up and ready, wanting to get married around about the time of the First World War. And she had a young man who was sent to the war and who was killed, as were tens of thousands of young men who died in the First World War. So she spent all her youth and her adult life supporting herself. She never married because there weren't enough men for young women who wanted to get married. So she supported herself working in tailoring as a felling hand, and that meant that she sewed in linings, coat linings, and she was a very bright and sparky woman, and she supported votes for women. She was very active and a charming person, and she was my favourite relation. I didn't grow up in London, and we used to come to London sometimes and to see her when she lived in Clapton from all the time I knew her. Her family, they moved around. People moved around a lot in those days. And they moved from St George's in the East, they went to Mile End, they went to one stage, she even lived in Stratford, I think. And during the Second World War, when, if you think that was about 1940, 1939, 1940, 1941, so she was already, in her 40s, she was living in a house in Graham Road in Dalston. And the houses were divided into, their rooms were let off in houses, and people shared a cooker on the landing, in the way that people did in those days. And during the war, well, when the bombing was on, she was standing on the landing cooking her evening meal. And this was in years after her mother had died. She heard her mother's voice tell her to get out of the house, which she did, and the house was bombed. And even now you can see where there's a little block of flats in Graham Road, which is where Auntie Fay had lived. Anyway, after that, eventually, having been bombed out of Graham Road, the Hackney Council rehoused her in a block of flats at Clapton Common, and they were flats that were built for single women, mainly women, I think, mainly women sort of who had never married because of the First World War. And that's where she lived when I knew her. And I came to London after I left university, and I used I worked for Hackney Council, and I used to go and see her on Thursday lunchtimes, and we'd have lunch and talk about the family and talk about all sorts of things. And she was a wise and interesting person, and I loved her a great deal. But when I was at university, I had met a Bengali boy he was a student there. He was studying physics, and I fell in love with him, and he wanted us to get married, and I wanted Auntie Faye to love him as much as I did. So I arranged for him to come and have lunch with me and Auntie Faye, and I would introduce him, and I was sure that it would be a great success. Well, as it happened, Auntie Faye didn't like him at all, which was very disturbing. But I'd thought at the time, and I think I misjudged her, really. I thought at the time she didn't like him because he was a Bengali. But now, when I look back, I realise that she had grown up in a time when there were no restrictions on immigration to this country, and lots of men came from Poland and Russia, and a lot of them left wives and children behind, and then started again here with other wives and children. And I think that this was her reaction to the knowledge that people who come from a long way away may have other relationships and things that one doesn't know about. But I knew he didn't have a wife. I knew that she was wrong, and one thing happened one thing happened after another, and we did get married, and eventually, after a number of years, he went off to America, and I stayed here. And by going off to America, he did the same thing that many Jewish men had done. They'd come to England for a while, and then they use England as a stepping stone to go to America. America, the Golden Medina, the source of all the wonderful wealth that people expect to find in America, that they fail to find in this country. And I was still in touch with his family because I got on very well with them, and on the whole. And I heard from people in the family that his parents had decided that he was going to have a proper marriage. It wasn't going to be a marriage to a foreigner. He was going to marry a Bengali girl. It was going to be an arranged marriage. And she was a very well-educated and a very good match in many ways. And he said that he would send for her, but he never did, because he did have a wife in America. And in a way, Auntie Faye recognised what can happen when people travel from one country to another in the search for new lives and security of all sorts. And although I wasn't the one who suffered, it was the Bengali girl. She was right that this is something that can happen to anybody when people move from one country to another.